This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. Underwear drawers are like the Wild West. You never know what you're going to pull out or what shape it's in. So upgrade your collection with the buttery soft comfort of MeUndies. MeUndies' signature fabric is as soft as a warm hug from your favorite sweater. Plus, it's breathable and oh so comfy, making it ideal for all-day wear. Get 20% off your first order, plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/Spotify with code SPOTIFY. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify, code SPOTIFY.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. On Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore what's critical to this important global relationship. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, TikTok, and even Hollywood. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 512, Operation Anthropoid. For Der Fuhrer, 1942 was to be the year of ending the war in the East. But first, he had to react to Stalin's massive and all-encompassing Eastern Front counterattacks, which had started in early December 1941. As we have seen, though taking almost unimaginable losses, the Russians pushed the Germans away from the edges of the Soviet capital due to the sheer numbers coming at them, the weather, and the fact that the invaders had almost bled themselves dry just to get here. Still, Operation Barbarossa, the knockout punch, had failed. The question now was, what came next? But before that could be answered, the Soviet counterattacks had to be dealt with. As we've seen, Army Group Center pulled back, or rather was pushed back, to the Rzhev line. And here, Hitler would retreat no further, for he still had ideas of taking Moscow. And since Rzhev is only 144 miles, or 231 kilometers west-northwest of the Soviet capital, it was still under threat. But Stalin wasn't done just yet, as he thought numbers were all that mattered. Next, as previously covered, we've seen how a large Soviet force was able to come over Rzhev and then get in behind the city, which was the northern end of Hitler's new battle line. This would be destroyed in time, but it set up other battles south of Rzhev that didn't move the line so much as simply destroy many Soviet soldiers. But the Germans lost men too. General Zhukov had been right when he told Stalin it would have been better to amass all those reserve forces and hit in the same relative area. But Stalin got his way, of course, and entire armies were lost because of it. At the same time as the Rzhev offensive, there was another offensive, this one by the Northwestern Front commander, Lieutenant General Pavel Kurotchin. His goal was to sever the link between the enemy position at Demyansk, located about 30 miles or 48 kilometers southeast of Lake Ilmen, which is itself about 80 miles south of Leningrad, and the Staraya Russa Railway to the northwest of Demyansk. That was the communications line of the German 16th Army. Or, looked at another way, Demyansk is on a line between Rzhev and Lake Ilmen, but closer to that body of water. Point is, while the Soviet 34th Army made sure that the German forces in and around Demyansk did not move any more east, the 11th and 1st Shock Army would go to the north around Demyansk, which would also threaten Staraya Russa, also held by the Germans, while the 3rd Shock Army swung around to the south. Initially, things looked good when this operation got underway. The link between Demyansk and Staraya was broken. Yet Stalin wanted more. For if the enemy around Demyansk could be destroyed, the Eastern Front would suddenly look very different, and Rzhev itself would be left dangling, truly exposed. Be that as it may, between the cold, the wooded and swampy terrain, the inexperienced Soviets tactically and literally could not move fast enough, giving the Germans time to react. And like most battles, if the enemy isn't knocked out in the original offing, then they have time to redeploy, bring in supplies, and basically be clever. And that's exactly what happened. But as this was a pocket, the Demyansk pocket, how did the Germans get resupplied? By airlift. This was a novel feature, but they pulled it off, bringing in supplies and another 15,446 troops, and respectfully, as long as the trapped Germans had supplies, they would be able to hold out, and did. Through late winter and early spring, the Northwestern Front commander hammered on the Germans at Demyansk and Staraya, but to no avail. By May 20th, the attacks were called off. The Germans still held the ground, but had lost 9,000 men, with another 46,000 wounded, and they also lost 265 aircraft, which would haunt them in the future. Whereas the Soviets lost at least 88,000 men and another 150,000 wounded. But Stalin had more in his vast cupboard. Also launched in January 1942, as Stalin, like Hitler, wanted 1942 to be the end of the war in the East, was the counteroffensive just southeast of Leningrad, which led to the Battle of Lyubin, or the Battle of the Volkhov River. This too was launched on January 7th, but due to the terrain, tanks would not be involved. No, this would be won or lost by infantry and artillery. And it would be the artillery that mattered most. The Russians came hard with 2 armies at Leningrad and another 4 armies south of this at the Volkhov, about 40 miles or 64 kilometers southeast of Leningrad. But German defensive positions were well entrenched, and they coordinated with each other to maximize their destructive power. As for the Soviet artillery, they didn't bring enough, and what they did have did not properly support the attacking infantry. And once the Soviets ran out of steam, Field Marshal George von Kuchler counterattacked, calling it Operation Wild Beast. The Soviet Second Shock Army was surrounded and destroyed. By June, the Second Shock Army's commander, Andrei Vlasov, was captured, and he would become a member of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia and a leader of the Russian Liberation Army, an anti-Stalin German creation. Like so many other of Stalin's counterattacks in these early days, the Soviets lost more men than the Germans. They lost 95,000 men, with another 213,000 wounded. And Leningrad was still surrounded.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
And bringing it full circle, as mentioned previously, the Barvenkovo-Lozovaya offensive, or counterattack, was another of Stalin's premature attempts. This is to the northeast of Crimea. But it didn't even last the month of January. Still, due to the sudden charge of many Soviet troops, they were able to push in about 100 kilometers, or almost 56 miles, disrupting Hitler's plans for the area once the Crimea was subdued. And as the Battle of Crimea was playing out, Stalin, thinking the enemy was highly focused down there, tried again during the second battle of this same area. On May 12, 1942, Marshal Timoshenko launched his offensive against the German Sixth Army, starting from the Barvenkovo salient, which had been created in January. And things started out well enough, but then Soviet inexperience raised its ugly head, and that, combined with massive airstrikes by the Germans, soon had the Soviet offensive falling apart, which came to a stop on May 15th. Again, Stalin had overestimated his chances, based on numbers, and failed to appreciate what the Germans could do even in their current state. Worse, the Germans then launched a pincer attack 2 days later, on May 17th. By the 22nd, some 250,000 Soviet troops were encircled. Then, their destruction began, with artillery, tanks, and bombs from above. After 6 days of this, the survivors surrendered. This allowed the Germans to launch 2 other limited attacks in the area. Operation Wilhelm, which encircled the Soviet 28th Army in mid-June, and the second limited offensive, which pushed back 2 other armies. And since Sevastopol would fall on July 4th, this encouraged Hitler to move on with his economic warfare, Case Blue, by having Army Group South go after the oil at Baku, along the Caspian Sea's western shore, in modern-day Azerbaijan. And yet, before watching Army Group South push its way ever eastward, there was one little hiccup in Hitler's world that took place on May 27, 1942, namely the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the only successful assassination of a senior Nazi leader during the war. Heydrich wore many hats: chief of the Reich Security Main Office, meaning Gestapo, head of Kripo, or Criminal Investigations, and the SD, or Security Service, which he founded, and Germany's intelligence organization. He was also the deputy acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, making up what once had been Western Czechoslovakia. Then there was his role as the president of the International Criminal Police Commission, or Interpol. But it was in one other capacity that he will always be remembered for, and that was the chair of the Wannsee Conference, which formalized plans for the final solution to the Jewish question. Learning at his father's knee, a German nationalist, Reinhard would go on to mourn Germany's defeat in the Great War, and he would hate the Versailles Treaty. With Germany's economy wrecked, young Reinhard joined the German Navy. His various positions there gave him some financial security, but he was not long for the Navy, as he was engaged to one lady when he took up with another. Thus, Admiral Erich Raeder himself dismissed Heydrich from the Navy in April 1931. The next day, he joined the Nazi Party in Hamburg. 6 weeks later, he joined the SS. Being pushed by his wife, Lena, he got an interview with the SS leader Heinrich Himmler, and he was told to set up an SS intelligence service. His influence grew as the Nazi Party grew. As Hitler was not yet Chancellor, Heydrich worked hard at bringing low the Nazis' enemies through violence, intimidation, and blackmail. And he was good at it. From there, it was heady times for Heydrich, being made head of the Gestapo in April of 1934, and he was vital in the Night of the Long Knives, the elimination of the SA Sturmabteilung, the SD's rival, where around 7,000 fellow Germans were murdered during the summer of 1934. And once Western Poland was occupied, Heydrich would create the unit that would exterminate over 100,000 Poles. His reward for such work was to be made the Deputy Reich Protector of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a part of the Czech Rump state, after the Sudetenland had been given to Germany by Britain and France. Though deputy, he was really in command, as his superior was seen by those in Berlin as being too soft on the Czech people. Soon Heydrich was suppressing rebellion, Germanizing those worthy of it, all the while making sure his charges kept producing Czech motors and Czech guns. But setting the tone when he first arrived in Prague, he had 142 people killed who were thought to be linked with the resistance. The killings would continue, and like in Poland, Heydrich focused on the intelligentsia, the military, and the priests, anyone capable of leading a resistance group, with thousands being killed or moved away to work elsewhere or to stay and work, but given soul and body-crushing conditions. In October of 1941, the Czechoslovak military intelligence decided to kill Heydrich. But like most things, this decision to remove Heydrich was wrapped in the political. Countries like Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece had started resistance groups just as soon as they were occupied, but not so much the Czech state. Of course, between the Munich Agreement and their quick defeat afterward, one can hardly blame the people there of feeling hopeless. But the exiled Czech-Slovak government of President Edvard Beneš would prove that his people were not on the side of the Axis. So when the British intelligence approached the president about this assassination, though the idea had originated with František Moravec, head of the Czech intelligence services, Beneš agreed. It was to be codenamed Anthropoid, in Greek, which means having the form of a human, clearly a reference to Heydrich.
Have you ever spotted McDonald's hot, crispy fries right as they're being scooped into the carton? And time just stands still. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
24 Czech soldiers were selected in October of 1941 and sent to an SOE commando training center in Scotland. But as the training was no picnic, men started getting hurt, which delayed the implementation. The men in charge were Warrant Officer Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, and they, with 7 others and 2 additional groups labeled Silver A and Silver B, flew out of the UK on December 28, 1941. Over the former Czech state, they parachuted out, landing east of Prague. The assassins contacted members of the Czech-Slovak resistance organization, but when they found out what the mission was, they wanted it stopped. Simply put, they said this would do nothing to help the war effort, but it would hurt the Czechs and Slovaks unimaginably, as the Axis forces would surely go on a killing spree. But President Beneš ordered for the operation to go forward, though he would deny this after the war. At first, Gabčík and Kubiš wanted to kill Heydrich on a train, as he would have nowhere to run. But they would be trapped as well. This was scrapped, as was the second option of killing Heydrich on his long driveway leading to his house. No, they would kill the SS man in Prague. It was to be public, hopefully terrorizing the Nazis. But now, with these various foiled plans, months had gone by, and now it was May 1942, which actually worked out in the operatives' favor. As Heydrich was cruel, he believed he had cowed the locals, and at times drove around alone in an open car. Also, he stuck to a schedule, and that would be his undoing. On May 27, 1942, Heydrich was being driven to his headquarters at Prague Castle. It was 10:30 a.m. His driver was SS Oberscharführer, or Senior Squad Leader, Johannes Klein. Waiting for him near a sharp turn where the car would have to slow down was Gabčík and Kubiš. They were standing near enough a tram stop, so it looked like they, as others, were waiting to jump on the tram. Heydrich's green, open-topped Mercedes 320 Cabriolet B came to the curve and slowed down, which is when Gabčík dropped his raincoat, exposing his Sten submachine gun. Heydrich saw this, but being the man that he was, instead of yelling, "Speed up," as to remove himself from this predicament, he told Klein to slow down, for he himself was going to punish this man for his impudence. Still in the back seat, Heydrich stood up and drew his Luger pistol. As Heydrich's attention was all on Gabčík, Kubiš, still not seen as a threat, threw a modified anti-tank grenade hidden inside a briefcase at the car. It was supposed to land on one of the seats, but instead, It went to the ground, near the rear wheel. Seconds later, the explosive detonated, sending fragments through the right rear fender, through the car, and carrying fragments of the seat material, which went into Heydrich's left side. Though he couldn't feel it at the moment, he had just suffered damage to his diaphragm, lung, spleen, and a rib was fractured. Kubish was hit with a fragment as well, in the face. On the other side of the street, the tram's windows were shattered. The vehicle came to a stop. Some of the passengers inside were also injured. To give an idea of the power of this blast, the two folded SS jackets in the car's back seat now hung over the trolley wire. Recovering from their initial shock of the blast, Heydrich and Klein jumped out of the car, with Klein running towards Kubish, the bomb thrower, who was dealing with the injury to his face, while Heydrich went after Gabčík, who still held the jammed Sten gun. Kubish recovered first. He got on his bicycle, his getaway vehicle, and started pedaling. But the people getting off the tram were in his way, so he raised a Colt M1903 pistol into the air and fired. The crowd parted. Yet a bicycle can only move so fast. This gave Klein time to draw a bead on him. He did so and attempted to fire, but in his current confused state, he depressed the magazine release catch instead. His gun jammed. Meanwhile, a still shell-shocked and injured Heydrich stumbled towards Gabčík. The latter made for his bicycle, but seeing he did not have enough time, threw down his Sten and got behind a telegraph pole. It wasn't much protection, but it was something. He lifted his weapon and fired at Heydrich. Heydrich, not sure if the shot missed, returned fire, to buy enough time to get behind the still stationary tram. But before he could do anything else, Heydrich doubled over, still only upright because he was leaning on a railing. Gabčík saw this and ran. Klein, seeing the same thing, ran over to his boss. But when he reached Heydrich, the latter still had enough fight left in him to say, pointing at Gabčík, "Get that bastard!" As Klein gave chase, Heydrich moved over to his damaged car and fell upon it. Gabčík, still on the move, knew the area was too open, so ran into a nearby butcher shop. He asked the butcher for help, but the man was a Nazi sympathizer, and his brother worked for the Gestapo. So instead of helping Gabčík, he ran into the street, got Klein's attention, and pointed into his shop. Klein started to run in, but his gun was still jammed. And during his few seconds alone, Gabčík realized he would get no help here, so he started to run out of the shop. The two combatants ran into each other in the doorway. However it happened, either in the initial contact or the struggle that came after, Gabčík fired twice, hitting the other man in the leg. Only then did Gabčík get aboard another tram and make good his escape. Happy to get away, still, both men were depressed, as they knew that Heydrich was still alive. The SS officer was rushed to a nearby hospital where several doctors operated on him, dealing with his injuries while trying to remove shrapnel splinters. Heydrich's superior, Himmler, sent his own physician to Prague, and by today's standards, the doctors performed admirably. They re-inflated his left lung, removed the tip of the fractured 11th rib, closed the diaphragm, and repaired other damage. Despite a fever, he seemed to be on the mend. But on June 3rd, as he was sitting up to eat, he suddenly went into shock, and then into a deep coma. The next day, June 4th, he died at 4:30 a.m. An autopsy showed that he had died of sepsis, that is, a condition where the body's response to infection causes injury to its own tissues and organs. Hitler's retribution for this outrage was cruel, but it could have been much worse. The area was producing for the German war effort, but in the end, some 5,000 people were killed in reprisal, and another 13,000 arrested, including Kubish's girlfriend, Anna. And then it got worse. Nazi intelligence incorrectly connected the assassination with the village of Lidice, as several Czech army officers, now in exile, had come from there. What followed was the Lidice massacre, where about 400 locals, almost evenly divided between men and women, were sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. About 95 children were also arrested, and most of them would not survive. And there would be other investigations, other killings. Heydrich received 2 funerals, one in Prague, the other in Berlin. As the number of killings grew in the former Czech state, both the Czechoslovakia government in exile and London were shocked, though why has to be questioned. Still, relations between the two remained troubled, as London had led the Munich Agreement and the Czech state was still seen as, by some allies, as being too compliant. But war is a murky business at best, where decisions are based on anything but the rational. And Churchill, being Churchill, wanted 3 German villages razed to the ground for every one Czech village destroyed. But that was his heart, not his head. And 2 years later, another operation, with a view to assassinating Hitler himself, was conceived, but not attempted. Next time, we'll return to Army Group South as Hitler seeks to take from Stalin the oil of Baku, which drives his weapons of war. And to cover this attack, a second Axis army will make for Stalingrad. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, we'll return to Army Group South next time. And there's a couple of other things, and since it's going to pretty soon be November of 42, hopefully we can bring in the Americans in North Africa as well, but we'll get there a little later. Anyway, so the latest members that I would like to say welcome aboard. Let's see here. Tim Perry from St. Charles, Missouri, Steve Gross, and Patrick Young. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Gentlemen you are, for supporting the show. And let's see, as far as donations, John Wilson from Charleston, South Carolina. I can say it like that because I am from Charleston, South Carolina. I was born at the Naval Hospital there. Anyway, I'd also like to thank Peter Borden for becoming a member and donating. Thank you very much, Peter. And of course, Mike Engel. Thank you very much, Mike. It is truly appreciated. And hopefully we don't get any more snow. Things can go back to normal here. And I will see you as soon as I can with the next episode. Take care, everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. Join me on a journey through the most destructive conflict in human history, a journey that will take us not just through the famous campaigns and cataclysmic battles, but also to the lesser well-known corners of the war that touched millions all over the world, as we try and answer not just the questions of what and where, but how and why. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.
I'm Dr. Samuel Hume, and I'm here to tell you about my new podcast, Winds of Change. Winds of Change is the story of how the sun set on the British Empire. This first season is on British India, and in these weekly episodes, we'll cover the whole history through to the final days of the Raj in 1947. If you love learning about the past and discovering why the world is the way it is, then listen to Winds of Change. You can listen to Winds of Change on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere you find great podcasts.